Dear friends, as the Genksolic team, are we young? Are we dynamic? Welcome to the Beer Tank, Beer Solic program, where we will be hosting dynamic young voices. Today, once again, we are together with a very young and vibrant guest. We are here with the esteemed Halil Çanakçı, our teacher. Welcome, teacher.
We found it nice, brother.
So, sir, without further ado, could you please introduce yourself?
Assalamu alaikum, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Halil Çanakçı. I work as an orthopedic specialist at Borksiye State Hospital. We are from Borksiye, born and raised. After graduating from Borksiye Vocational School, I specialized at the Faculty of Medicine in Erzurum. After working in Arnak, Ankara, and Bursa, I have been working as an orthopedic specialist at Borksiye State Hospital since 2012.
MashaAllah, may God forgive you. Sir, recently we watched both your heroics and those of other activists in relation to the Sumud flotilla. In fact, today we intend to base our interview a bit around this topic. How did you decide to take part in this process?
Of course, when we talk about Sumud, there is a background to it as well. Since we were part of the Turkish delegation, let me explain this from the very beginning. This was an activity carried out with 4 elements, both on the Turkish side and internationally. Of course, there's no need to drag it out too much. Now, first of all, after the Gaza situation began, after the 7th of October, we, together with our doctor friends, started working on what could be done and how we could get to Gaza. During those efforts, as we consulted with Hüseyin Durmaz, Ibrahim Tars, and our psychiatrist friend from Borksiye, with whom we were working together, an action was taken in Geneva regarding the opening of a humanitarian corridor, a health corridor. We, as the Turkish delegation, started to come together there a bit. After that, as you know, we, as the March to Gaza team, first launched the March to Gaza team, which is a part of the Global Sumud Initiative, as the Rafah Road, or Rafah March, in Egypt, and as you know, we organized a march to lift the blockade in Rafah. There was a European leg to this, and a Turkish leg as well. We all took action together. That was one element. After that, another element of Sumud, at the same time, was the Sumud convoy coming from the Maghreb region. There was an activity carried out by the Muslim countries in that region. Another was the Malaysian and Indonesian team, who perhaps paved the way for this multi-ship departure. They also launched a Gaza program with 1,000 ships. Perhaps that was what inspired us a bit as well. Maybe that was also the reason why this multi-ship movement to break the blockade began. Then, there is also the Freedom Flotilla, which has included the Navy Marmara for years and acts together with it, a group mainly made up of European and American activists. They too are constantly organizing sea voyages to break the Gaza blockade. As you know, together with our March to Gaza team, they also launched the Madden and Hanzala ships in June. Of course, in the same way, they sped up the process quite a bit to create an agenda. Of course, these 4 teams came together and, if I'm not mistaken, it was June in Tunisia. We attended together with our general coordinator, the Turkey coordinator Hüseyin Durmaz, and our doctor brother. Here, well, in general, it was decided how the movement would proceed, which ships would set off, how many ships there would be, from which port they would depart, and the average number of people was determined. There, they allocated a 10% quota for us from Turkey. They didn't really want too much participation from Muslim countries. As you know, previously, due to the Navy Marmara and so on, they wanted to keep the dialogue with Hamas to a minimum. So, the general framework was set there. Non-violence trainings were conducted. Because of the Navy Marmara, they really didn't want any kind of violence or mutual aggression. You know, as Muslims, perhaps we have a bit of a desire for martyrdom. In some respects, we had prepared ourselves, but afterwards, since they came as a more humanist, anti-imperialist movement, standing against oppression, they see things a bit differently from us in those areas. That's why, along with the decisions and trainings on non-violence, the general outlines were drawn and legal trainings were provided.
If I'm not mistaken, those who drew up the general outlines were from Spain in 2021.
No, in general, from the 4 elements we mentioned, a sort of upper delegation team of about 2 or 3 people from each was formed. From Turkey, Hüseyin Abi and another friend also joined. We were one of the elements of the March to Gaza team, but I estimate there was a general upper delegation of nearly 20 people. Of course, after the general consultations were held, those friends usually followed up on things.
Well, sir, the part you've described so far is a bit more about the material side. From a spiritual perspective, as a human being and as a Muslim, how did your process of getting involved here unfold?
Now, Ibrahim, actually, I try to explain this to young people a bit. Let me put it this way, from a professional point of view, let me explain this a bit from my own field. When I was studying at the Imam Hatip School, as you know, we focused more on vocational and theology courses. Back then, around middle school, I had the intention of becoming a mufti. Then, as I started doing better in science subjects, and since my father is also a theologian to some extent, he brought up the idea, saying, "Son, could you also consider studying medicine?" That became a topic of discussion. Of course, at that time, since Imam Hatip had a more spiritual atmosphere, I wondered, why medicine? Well, as you know, being a doctor is a wonderful opportunity, especially in terms of humanitarian aid and helping people, alhamdulillah, because God grants us so many limitless opportunities. Of course, it also has its own status and material benefits. At the moment, when you graduate as a doctor in Turkey, there is absolutely no risk involved. As you know, you start working and earning money straight away. There are material benefits, but we really need to highlight the spiritual side of it. Unfortunately, as Muslims in recent times, we are also weak in these areas, but I was also drawn to medicine because of its spiritual aspects and the benefits it brings in that sense. That's why I wanted to become a doctor. After that, alhamdulillah, I went to Gaza. There was that period of bombing, together with the doctor from Niger. Afterwards, I had the opportunity to join the Mavi Marmara. As you know, when there was a serious crisis in Somalia, we carried out medical work there at that time. We also did so in Bangladesh and Syria. There was an earthquake in Pakistan. So, in a way, my Sumud journey is somewhat related to my initial choice of profession. I made such a request to God. My Lord opened the way for me every year, every time, again and again. Finally, with this Sumud, my Lord granted us such an opportunity to serve people. I especially try to explain this to young people. After Sumud, my Lord granted us the chance to meet with many young people. So, if young people set themselves a goal and strengthen themselves a bit more by drawing closer to my Lord through their worship, there is no door that my Lord will not open for them. So, that's why I can say that my Sumud journey actually started all the way back when I chose medicine in secondary school, alhamdulillah.
Actually, sir, while we were following your experiences during the on-call period, what you went through on that ship and so on, there were conversations among ourselves about it. It's not a process that everyone is destined to experience. To join Sumud, to board that ship, to get involved in this struggle, maybe that's a wrong conclusion, maybe even a negative one. But to me, it feels a bit like this. It seems that previous experiences, a person's earlier stance, their way of life, their words, have brought about this fate, have called this destiny upon them. Maybe that's how we should look at it. So, sir, how was your experience after you joined?
Let me explain it a bit like this. We actually wanted to board from Tunis, from Sicily, because it would have been easier from Tunis, since there were more participants from Muslim countries. But since we had green passports, the three of us doctors went to Sicily. It was a bit out of necessity, from Italy. Green passport. As you know, they don't require a Schengen visa. After we got there, instead of waiting the usual 3 or 4 days, we ended up waiting about 15 days. This was actually a significant gain for us. We received training in the church there, and as I mentioned, while about 20% were Muslims, the remaining 80% were Europeans, activists, as you know, people coming from many different countries around the world. There was a significant age difference, from an 18-year-old lad from New Zealand to an 87-year-old from a European country. We listened to some of their stories. At that point, we started to think about what we could offer these people. Because, as I said, most of them don't have a fixed religious belief. Maybe they were born into a Christian family, maybe there was some religious background from their family. Some families had certain religious structures. But these are generally people who are searching, who don't have a fixed belief, and that's when we started to wonder what we could offer them. They're a bit anti-imperialist, left-leaning, people who empathize with the troubles of the oppressed, and that really made us think, why haven't we spoken up with these people until now? Especially in a church, there was my friend Errol, who was my mate on the ship. When he recited the call to prayer, seeing the other people listening to it, the spiritual pleasure they took from it, all of that really affected us deeply. We thought to ourselves, people must be so concerned about Gaza that, for example, one of them said, a friend of ours. Of course, I don't really remember their names since they were foreigners. So when they said, every morning when we wake up with Gaza on our minds, I thought to myself, I don't wake up with Gaza every morning, Ibrahim. This is a big shortcoming. That's why, I believe, God has given them this organization for that reason. In fact, some of our friends became Muslim. From now on, God willing, as the Sumud team, as a delegation, we will continue these processes with these people. In fact, God willing, the general delegation meeting will be held in Turkey next week. If we can be an example to these people, we pray to God for their conversion to Islam, and God willing, may God grant us a good outcome.
Hassan Hokam, it also seems quite interesting. At least when we look at it in Turkey, those who take up the Gaza issue are usually the group we might call the right wing. In fact, the other side dismisses it, saying things like, they're Arabs, and doesn't pay much attention. But when we look at Europe, or maybe America, interestingly enough, we've heard from you that it's the left-wing groups and various organizations there that have embraced this issue extremely strongly and care about it a great deal. So, sir, you received training. And after the training, the process began. How did this process unfold, and how did it continue?
Now, Ibrahim, they first set off from Barcelona. Of course, while we were supposed to wait there for just 3 or 4 days, we ended up waiting for about 15 days. We formed a great team there. There were people like Gulden Sonmez from IHH and Ersin Selik. It was a good environment for us. Those 15 days brought us quite a lot of gains. After that, on the 1st of the month, probably the 1st of September, they set off from Barcelona. They arrived in Tunisia with a delay. Due to a bit of a storm, they lost a few more days. After that, they arrived in Tunisia. There was quite a commotion in Tunisia. I mean, the Israeli occupying state did everything it could to slow down and sabotage the process. As you know, they carried out a drone attack in Tunisia. By influencing the Tunisian government, especially regarding the ships built by Muslim countries, ours and Malaysia's, they probably had their own people within the delegation as well. While our target was 70 or 80 ships, this number dropped to 40 or 50. After a bit of their interference, the Tunisian government decided not to let the ships depart. They really dragged out the process. Because more than half of our Turkish friends who went to Tunisia couldn't join the voyage. So, as a delegation, we faced serious difficulties because of this. After that, they set off from Tunisia again. If I remember correctly, it was around 13 September. After leaving Augusta, we departed from Augusta port on the 13th. At the southernmost Porto port, Siljan, after waiting there for 5 or 6 days, on the 19th September, we set off with those coming from Barcelona and Tunisia. As you know, there was another drone attack in Tunisia. A few days after we set off, there was another serious drone attack. They attacked them with a drone about 10 or 15 times. These were bombs a bit more powerful than regular series bombs, because their aim was to prevent the sailing ships and boats from continuing their journey, to break the sails and so on and so forth. They were also somewhat effective on a few boats. After that, while we were planning to go directly to Gaza, this time we wanted to wait a bit near Crete. We were already going to meet up with the Greek boats there. So, they are.
Not because of the attacks.
Of course. We weren't actually planning to enter Crete. They are effective. So, it's a bit like this. The delegation team holds consultation meetings after these kinds of attacks, and they have long, drawn-out meetings, so that no wrong move is made. Of course, this turned out to be a good thing in a way. The prolonging of the process really kept the Gaza issue alive on the world agenda, as you know. And these had an impact on governments, put pressure on them, and with hundreds of thousands, 250,000, 300,000 people, meetings, they created pressure on governments. And these also seriously isolated Israel at the United Nations and became a source of pressure. These were the positive aspects of the process as well. I mean, for us, waiting 3 or 5 days isn't really a big problem, but it feels like a handicap. Why are we delayed? Why aren't we setting off? But, as our Lord says, there is good in what we perceive as bad, so we believe that's the case here. In other words, the flotilla process became integrated with the United Nations meetings. As you know, Netanyahu gave his speech in a hall that was 80% empty. After that, we set off again. Ibrahim, that's classic from Jirit. With these, whether it's Hanzala, then Madlin, or Mavi Marmara, there's always a 60 to 80 mile limit. And that's when Israel intervenes. At one point, of course, Italy sent a military ship, and Spain did as well. At one stage, we came across Turkish ships there, with warships. They helped the ships that were stranded and transferred the Red Crescent supplies to our ships. Of course, seeing a Turkish ship, there was something special for us as well. It made us feel pleased. After that, once you reach that classic border, they come, cut off your internet, warn you, and cut your GPS. Then they try to stop you for about half an hour. Since there were quite a few boats, they couldn't intervene all at once and had to go one by one, in order. They tried to stop you by spraying this water they've taken from the sea onto you like a fountain. Of course, we didn't stop. None of the captains stopped either. After that, they board the ship, and once on board, they stop the boat. They take you down below. It was the usual procedure, but it wasn't like what happened on the Mavi Marmara. After seeing the reactions around the world to what happened on the Mavi Marmara, this time they captured us there in a softer manner, let's say, with cameras on them. Because they come in international waters. They occupy you and your boat, and they take you captive. After about 10 or 10.5 hours, they took them to Ashdod port, and after that, the refugee process began. So, what did they do differently this time compared to the Marmara? They started treating you as terrorists. On the Marmara, they came in hard at first, then continued more softly. This time, they entered softly but treated us harshly, treating us like terrorists. After that, the refugee process began, waiting on hot asphalt, sometimes half an hour, or for some people, 3 or 4 hours. After that, it was the passport and fingerprinting process for the refugees. Once that was over, they put us in prison vans. Thank God, we are grateful to our Lord for that. In other words, it became a great honor for us. To ride in the prison vans that the veteran Muslims rode in, to stay in the same prison where they stayed, to wear the clothes they wore, to breathe the same air as them, Alhamdulillah, it was a great honor for us.
Hodja, I might take you a bit back. But in terms of the purpose and aim of the Sumud flotilla, maybe it's not that important. But there is a particular point that young people are especially curious about. After that, I'll ask you to continue the story from where we left off. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Hodja, you had a boat journey that lasted about 10 to 15 days.
Ours lasted 22 days.
22 days in a space. How many people were you?
10 people.
10 people. So, both women and men had to be together during that time, Hodja. You know, maybe the eating arrangements, the prayer times.
Ibrahim, let me put it this way. Since I took part in the Mavi Marmara, I compared some things with that experience and felt sad about certain aspects. For example, some things were a plus, while others were a minus for Muslims. Now, by God's will, on the Mavi Marmara, we were able to organize things. They joined us, and we paid attention to many aspects of our lives, like keeping men and women separate, and so on. But what happens this time? The organization was entirely theirs. Since we were following them, yes, they're good people, humanists, anti-imperialists, they're on the side of the oppressed. Maybe they support this cause even more than we do, but of course, in terms of lifestyle, we have our own criteria, like our standards regarding modesty, our requirements for prayer. I mean, because they're so relaxed, for example, I found it a bit difficult at those points. European Muslims have lived in the same environment with them and have got used to it, but we struggled a bit. I mean, in the places where we slept, their comfortable clothing made us think. So it seems we're a bit lacking in this regard, since God granted it to them, not to us. We really felt a serious deficiency at that point. But they're very respectful. Are they respectful towards our way of life, our acts of worship? They are respectful, and as I said before, though it bears repeating, they have a real hunger. They observe you, for example, when you get up in the morning and perform your prayers. So you also need to be careful around them. Sometimes I would watch our brothers, and they would completely adopt their way of life. In certain respects, just like them, but we are Muslims. So, if we want to teach them about Islam or associate them with Islam, we shouldn't compromise too much on certain points. Because one day, when they encounter Islam, they might say, well, if this is how it is in Islam, then why do these Muslims act differently? I think, in that regard, that in environments where Islamic life is practiced, things should be taken more seriously, so that later on, those people don't end up in a dilemma.
Also, sir, I'd like to ask you something. I've heard this from you a few times, but I want this memory to remain on our channels as a kind of youthful keepsake. So, before starting the process, there is a fatwa about praying with your eyes while lying down.
We have Yesar, our brother from Antep, a very sociable guy. He said something like this. While we were together in Sicily, he said, friends, I got a fatwa from a scholar. He said, during sea journeys, you can perform ablution and pray with your eyes. I said, for God's sake, brother, this is the vast open sea. Can you really do such a thing with seawater? I told him, you should reconsider this fatwa. Then we set off on our journey. At first, of course, we waited at Porto Harbour for 5 or 6 days in August. The sea was calm at the harbour, but once we left Porto Harbour, not so much from Sicily, but we were tossed about in 2 or 3 meter waves so much that my friends ended up being sick. Of course, I threw up as well at that point. I already get a bit queasy, even in a car, brother. I just threw myself down below and lay there. Now, I remember thinking the prayer time would probably pass, so I did my ablutions with just a little water and prayed. After that, I just fell asleep, and I didn't wake up for a long time after that, because when you wake up, you get seasick again, so may God bless the teacher who gave that fatwa.
So, sir, you went to prison. I'd like to hear a bit from you about your time in prison, and then I'll ask you about your return, brother.
The prison period was like this. As I said, the soldiers treated us gently. At that point, they presented themselves as gentle to the world. But after that, the treatment as refugees and terrorists began. Those ministers came, repeatedly provoking us, using the word terrorist several times. You are terrorists who help other terrorists. And there, this is what I felt. Of course, everyone tells different stories, what the Israeli soldiers did, the handcuffing, and during that process I mentioned earlier, when they were moving us around as refugees, some had their necks pushed down, some were chatted to, and some soldiers took out their personal frustrations on people. So, this process can vary from person to person. But for us, since we were somewhat used to it, it wasn't much of a problem. You know, that whole signature business, they make you sign at the law office. I mean, let me put it this way earlier. I tried to explain that in particular, because the process was a bit troublesome, there was some discord. So, there, the general delegation, Muslims, in fact, the Palestinians, decided not to go. Because the Israelis would cause a lot of trouble for those people. As I said, since they view us a bit differently, the general delegation didn't want anyone to have problems there. They didn't want the Palestinians to participate. Since we Turks are associated with Hamas, they kept our numbers low. They tried to keep the number of Muslims low at that time. You know, regarding the signature, was it about recognizing the legitimacy of the Israeli government or calling them occupiers? There's no such thing, really. There, it was recommended that we sign it as soon as possible, to minimize the risk of arrest or detention in Israel, and a delegation decision was made. There, with a note of objection, we stated that the occupation forces detained us in international waters. We signed saying, "We do not accept this, we want to return to our country as soon as possible." After that, the signatures didn't really matter much anyway. In other words, there wasn't much difference in the return process between those who signed and those who didn't. I'd like to mention that as well, it was a bit of a troublesome process regarding that. They put us into prison vans. That was what caught our attention the most there. As I said, these were places where Palestinian, wounded Muslims breathed the air. We saw these places and the writings on the walls. It keeps happening to me again and again. I've said it every time, but there were places where a father had written the dates of his son's martyrdom. Our friends saw it, and I saw it too. But let me recount that through a friend's words. As I said, from an 18-year-old young lad to an 87-year-old uncle, they treated everyone exactly the same there. They subjected us to personal, physical, and psychological pressure. So, for about 24 hours, from our perspective, the friends who came after us stayed even longer, and we had a period in prison there. After that, as you know, Turkish Airlines had built an airport at the southernmost point there. They took us from there. We were the first to arrive with Turkish Airlines. The next group came via Greece, and the last group came through Jordan. They brought us back in 3 groups. This was partly because of their own reasons, because of their holidays and so on. On Saturdays, due to the Sabbath, they don't do any work. So they released us in 3 separate groups.
Yes, sir. Finally, of course, there are probably many more details about Sumut. God willing, if we have the chance, we'll do interviews with our other Sumut heroes as well. Maybe we'll ask them for the other details too. After this peace agreement, sir, so-called peace agreement, we noticed that the boycott had eased a bit. Maybe this has started happening to us as well. What would you like to say about this, sir?
Now, about the boycott I mentioned earlier, during the Italy period, there's a place called Catania in Sicily. We took part in a protest in that area. For example, we saw cola directly branded with the name Gaza, literally, cola with the name Gaza on it. That's when I saw it myself. I never thought Europeans would pay this much attention to the boycott, mate. But honestly, they really do pay close attention, and during our voyage on that ship, their refusal to drink cola at many points, they were very sensitive about it too. So, as Muslims, we need to be even more sensitive. And the effectiveness of the boycott is more or less evident in many places. There are Starbucks branches and so on. This is a fact. We need to continue being sensitive about this issue. The Gaza situation isn't over, mate. Alright, fair enough. There's been a peace agreement in Gaza. I think the process will continue. Some people think it won't. But hopefully there will be a ceasefire, a period of peace, and hopefully Muslims will have some relief for a while. But will this process start again afterwards? It will. These people have a goal here. That is, it's about Greater Israel, Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and so on. Look, at these points, absolutely, there was a momentum gained in Sumut, especially with the boycott. With sensitivities, people became focused. But this process absolutely must not lose steam. That momentum, that upward trend needs to continue. We need to pay attention to the boycott. We need to be mindful of our sensitivity towards Gaza. Sumut was a means, not an end. So, after Sumut is over, since our real goal, the process regarding Gaza and Palestine, will continue, these efforts absolutely need to increase so that, in the longer term, we can strengthen our position.
Alright, sir, before we close and finish the first part of our program, is there anything else you'd like to add?
As I said, we are students of the Gaza school. Gaza is one of our oppressed lands. In fact, it's East Turkestan, it's Arakan, it's Myanmar, and Gaza is among the oppressed lands. Actually, we have to go through their schools, because when we stand before my Lord, in His presence, we will be held accountable for these things. We are intermediaries, not the end goal. We need to continue our work and sensitivities seriously, focusing on the objectives. This is a necessity for ourselves. Now, when it comes to our sensitivities about Jerusalem, our faith-based strength and sincerity are of great importance. To give an example of this, as you know, there is the incident of Saladin and the morning prayer. During a Friday sermon, a young man stands up and says to Saladin, "O Saladin, why have we still not conquered Jerusalem?" Saladin does not respond at all. And the next day, when he goes to the morning prayer, Saladin looks around and cannot see the young man, so he says, "Bring that young man to me." But unfortunately, they cannot find the young man at the morning prayer. At that point, he says something quite profound. He says, "When we turn the Friday congregation into the morning prayer congregation, that is when we will conquer Jerusalem." And indeed, he prepares and educates the society for this, and eventually conquers Jerusalem. Because at that time, the Friday prayer congregation becomes the morning prayer congregation, and they achieve the conquest. That's why, if we truly care about Gaza and other oppressed regions, prayer is extremely important, especially the morning prayer. We really need to pay serious attention to ourselves in these matters. I'd like to share another story. Generally, during these kinds of journeys, in our efforts with the oppressed, we end up traveling a lot. Sometimes there are different kinds of work involved. There's also an incident involving Hazrat Umar. This happened with one of the female companions, our mother. I'd like to share that as well. So, our mother, the female companion, goes to Hazrat Umar and says, "O Umar, O Caliph, we can't see our husbands. Our children can't see their fathers either," she says, because as you know, it was a time of constant wars and conquests. At that time, they made a decision together with Hazrat Umar. The campaign, jihad, or work in the way of Allah would last 4 months a year. That's why, especially our women, need to allow their husbands at least 4 months a year for Islamic work, so that we can continue the tradition of Hazrat Umar, inshallah.
Of course, my Lord. May Allah grant us the ability to understand and put it into practice in our lives, inshallah. Thank you very much, teacher. As the Genk Soluk team, today on our program Beer Talk Beer Soluk, we hosted our esteemed elder and teacher, Rifat Çanakçı. Inshallah, from now on, we will be hosting many more guests and young voices on Beer Talk Beer Soluk. Don't forget to like and follow. Stay safe.